With that, Jenna, take it away.
No, we already.
Oh, Leora, I'm sorry.
Yes, it's
Leora, take it away.
It could have been Jenna, but in fact, my connection is I went to Brown University, and so I'm good. So Katherine is a medical anthropologist who has conducted ethnographic fieldwork in China and the U.S., and she received her PhD from Harvard Yale. She did an RWJ fellowship at Columbia. And then she joined Brown and the Population Studies and Training Center. So Mason's research, I've got this on the website. Mason's research addresses issues in medical anthropology, anthropological demography, population health, bioethics, global health science and technology studies, China studies, and gender studies. So you may have noticed there's a whole lot there. She does this in ways that combines different perspectives, and so by doing so facilitates new ways of looking at old and emerging societal processes and issues. She is broadly interested in how populations and communities are created and conceptualized, especially in the field of public health, and how people form relationships with these abstract entities. Her first book, Infectious Change, Reinventing Chinese Public Health After an Epidemic, is based on field work she conducted in southeastern China on the professionalization of public health in China following the 2003 SARS epidemic. And her most recent publication that I found is called The Correct Secret, Discretion and Hyper-Transparency in Chinese Biosecurity, which should tell you how broad-reaching her research can go. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Katherine Mason.
Thank you so much for that really nice introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. I appreciate being invited despite my not being a demographer. I do dabble in demographic issues, which is what I'm going to try to talk with you guys about today. But there aren't going to be a lot of numbers here, except numbers that are not mine, so it's going to be mostly words. But I do think that to frame what I'm going to be talking about, I think that it is helpful to put up a few numbers. Again, none of these are mine. They're easily available numbers. One just being the population of China, right, which is very big, as all of you know. This population count is probably pretty accurate, but we have to view with suspicion anything coming from the China National Bureau of Statistics. It should be evident from the next number, which shows a bit of a discrepancy between the rough estimate of what's called the floating population, I'll explain what that is in a second, and the official estimate, which is some 100 million fewer than what people think actually is there. So that should give you a sense of how inaccurate some of these statistics are, something to keep in mind. The floating population, for those of you not familiar, refers to rural to urban migrant workers that move to cities but don't necessarily just settle down in one place. So they're moving from city to city, from job to job, back to the countryside and back to the city again. And actually, every year, there is, again and again, the biggest migration in human history when the vast majority, literally the biggest migration in human history, when the vast majority of these migrant workers go back to their hometowns for Chinese New Year. And there's an interesting film about this that I'm now forgetting the name of, but you can look it up. Okay, and the third number I'm going to give you at the outset is 2011, which was the year that China officially became a majority urban country. And this is not my data, again, and not my graph, but I think the visual is helpful just to see how quickly this transformation happened. And this is just the official urban population, so you can assume that in terms of numbers of people at any given time actually in the cities, it's probably happened a little bit earlier. Okay, so the part of China and the populations I'm going to be talking about today are in the Pearl River Delta region, which is this area in southeastern China, right on the border with Hong Kong and Macau, which are usually considered to be part of the Pearl River Delta region. And it comprises about 11 large and medium-sized cities, all within really close proximity to each other. So we're talking like a 2-hour driving radius. This is also an official number of the number of people living in these urban centers in the Pearl River Delta, but again, that number is probably a wild underestimate. And numbers I've heard from people working in city governments indicated something closer to twice that in terms of people who are just in these cities at any given time. So this about a third of the population of the United States in this one sort of 2-hour radius area. Okay, and then the third set of numbers I'll give you is for a city that I call in my book Chiang Mai, and I just want to note from the outset that any of you familiar with China will probably very quickly know what city I'm talking about. And I'm going to use the pseudonym anyway because I use it in my book for a variety of reasons that I explain there. And so even though it may be obvious to some of you, I'm just going to go ahead and use that pseudonym just to let you know. So this is a city in this region. It's not listed on the map here. I found a map that didn't have it there so that I wouldn't give myself away that easily. And it was literally built from scratch in the span of 34 years. Okay, so it was a collection of rural villages in 1980, and then was a city of officially 10.5 million people as of 2014. So it rose up out of nothing, essentially. And so there are a couple of discrepancies in numbers here that I think are interesting. One is, of course, the incredibly fast pace of building that city. And then the other is this discrepancy, again, between how many people are officially in Chiang Mai and how many people are probably in Chiang Mai at any given time. And that number in 2014 was quoted to me, again, by city officials as being closer to 20 million. Okay. So who are these missing people? Well, for the most part, they're part of this floating population, which made up something like 60 to 80% of the population as of 2010. You'll notice this was 16 million in 2010, this is the estimate given to me. The estimate given to me in 2014 was 20 million. I don't think anyone quite knows exactly how many people are here, but it's a lot. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about a number of different mobile populations, including this one, that interact with each other in interesting ways in the realm of public health, which is where I was really doing my research. So one is the floating population. The other is, this is sort of a dorky picture from my fieldwork. The other is educated elites who migrated around the same time to Chiang Mai. Most of the people I met had come in just the last 10 to 15 years. And they also were not really totally settled down. So some of them were, but a lot of them intended to keep moving, and many of them intended to go abroad. So I would say about 3/4 of the people I knew who were educated elites who were working in public health in Chiang Mai at the time I was doing my research, about 3/4 of them either had spent time abroad or had plans to do so. And this was really important to them, both with regards to their career development, but also with regards to how they perceive themselves as sort of cosmopolitan elites. They wanted to feel that they were worldly. And so going abroad for some period of time, whether for study or just to work there briefly or just to visit and do a training even, was something that was really important. And they also moved around to different cities in this region as well to some extent. So this is the second mobile population. And then the third mobile population is not human, and this is the population of mobile viruses. Now, the Pearl River Delta is known in epidemiology as a place where a lot of viruses originate, a lot of new viruses, emerging viruses. So every year when they figure out what to put in the flu vaccine, this is one of the places that they look. It was also the origin of the 1968 flu pandemic and the origin of SARS in 2003, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So this was really front and center. This particular mobile population was really front and center in terms of what people were worrying about in public health. And what I talk about in my book is the interaction of these three different populations. So the way, in particular, in which these transnational elites regarded the rural to urban migrants as aiding and abetting these emerging diseases. And what I argue in the book is that in working to serve the common good, which is what they felt that their job as public health folks was, that they engaged in a slippage that left out from this idea of the common, like who is the common and the common good. Most of the people who actually lived in their city. So when they were talking about serving the common good, they were talking about this small minority of people kind of like them, as opposed to most of the people who were actually there. And that this had something to do with this concern about diseases. So that's what I argue in my book, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of that argument, and I'm going to talk about something a little more specific for the rest of the talk. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a sense of the fieldwork that I did, because I'm an anthropologist, so we tend to do a lot of in-person immersion type fieldwork, a little bit different from what most demographers do. So this was kind of a classic ethnographic field study. I spent a little over a year, mainly between 2008 and 2009, in the Pearl River Delta, primarily in the city I'm calling Chiang Mai, but also in some of the other cities around there. And I did some follow-up research in 2010 and 2014 just to update myself on what was going on. And most of what I was doing involved working at a local public health institution called the Tianmai CDC. And this was a city-level public health institution that did disease control. I worked with colleagues in their offices. I traveled around with them as they went around the city. I helped with project implementation. One of the more fun things I did was dress in biohazard suits and use those fever guns that you stick at people's foreheads to see if they had to go be quarantined. I volunteered in an outpatient migrant clinic that I'm going to tell you all a little bit about. And I also did some translation, which was sort of the deal for why they were letting me hang around there. That and teaching English to the director's son. I interviewed center leaders and I participated in center events. And in addition to this, I did some supplementary field work at some of the district level CDCs. So I'll explain the CDC system in a minute, but there are a lot of these local institutions at different administrative levels. So I did a little bit of field work at the district level. It was called the street level, as well as in some other related public health institutions. I also did some field work in Guangzhou, that is the real name of the city, and that's nearby, at some of their local institutions, as well as at a public health school. I did some site visits in Beijing, and I also visited the Hong Kong Center for Health Protection. Okay, so to understand what I'm talking about today, I want to give you guys a little bit of a history of public health in China, just briefly, and go over in particular 3 different transitions that I think are important for kind of understanding what's going on now. So the first was when Chairman Mao came to power in 1949, and Chairman Mao did a lot of bad stuff. I don't think it's too controversial to admit that at this point, but he also did do some good stuff, and one of the things that most people think was sort of unequivocally good that he did was to really make an improvement in grassroots public health. And so I'm going to give you some more numbers that are widely used in the English language literature. My Chinese colleagues don't believe them at all for the same reasons I told you earlier. But nevertheless, very impressive, huge drops in infant mortality rates, life expectancy doubling, and this is over the course of 25 years. Sexually transmitted diseases were almost eliminated. That was very short-lived, so they've come back with a vengeance now, but for a short period of time, they were almost eliminated. And the barefoot doctor model that Mao developed became an international model for grassroots public health, so it was sort of adopted by other countries and held up as this great thing to be doing. And what barefoot doctors were ordinary peasants who were trained for a few months, basically, to become paraprofessionals. So they would do basic primary care, they would lead mass mobilizations for sanitation campaigns, were called patriotic health campaigns. So this was mobilizing the masses to clean up, basically, and improve sanitation in their villages. And sometimes this involved doing things like going through the streams and picking out the snails that carry schistosomiasis one by one to get rid of that, and as well as building latrines and things like that, and vaccination campaigns as well. So even though these numbers are probably not totally accurate, I think everyone agrees that there were a lot of improvements. Yes?
I'm wondering what your Chinese colleagues doubt about these numbers. The numbers reflecting Western, well, mostly U.S. demographers, I would think, as they analyzed.
Yeah, it was Western observers who came, and I have to say that if you read the material from this time, it was extremely romanticized. Like Chairman Mao is this wonderful master who's done all of these amazing things. I mean, people really drank the Kool-Aid over here. So, I mean, there's a lot of cynicism about these numbers. I tried as I couldn't figure out exactly where they originally came from, but they were sort of all over the English language literature. I think people felt like these things did greatly improve, but probably not quite to the extent that's being published here. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Since the Great Famine occurred in the 50s,
Yeah.
I'm just sort of struggling with life expectancy doubling and infant mortality rate declining. I mean, so
Yeah, so there was a big blip. So if you look at, and I'm not showing you graphs because I'm not a numbers person, but if you look at the graphs of both of those indicators, there is a big dip, right, at the time of the famine in the late 50s and early 60s, and then it comes back up. So it's a pretty short-lived effect. And I think most people who study this think that that's pretty true. So the general trend was still improvement. But you're right, yeah, there's a big dip at that time. Are there other questions? about this? Okay, so in general, this was good for the most part. We're not sure exactly how good, but it was good. Now what happened was that Chairman Mao died in 1976 and the reform period started, and the focus of the reform period was entirely on economic development. And so public health, as is in the case in a lot of places where people are focused on economic development, fell by the wayside. No one was investing in this anymore. The barefoot doctors kind of scattered and went and did something else. The patriotic health campaigns kind of stopped happening for the most part, and more to my point that I'm going to be focusing on today, the actual physical infrastructure that was built around this started to just be neglected and break down. So one of the things that Mao did to facilitate all of these efforts was to build thousands of what were called anti-epidemic stations, all at all levels of government, so from the provincial level down to the villages. And these were just places where these campaigns were kind of staged from, and there were various sort of basic health facilities there. Now these all fell apart basically over the reform period. No one was paying any attention, they didn't get any funding anymore. Like I said, things like syphilis and gonorrhea came roaring back, and some of these indicators probably got a little worse. But the Chinese government did eventually decide that maybe this was not very good. And so in the late 1990s, they started trying to remake the public health system into what they called the CDC system. And this was explicitly modeled after the US CDC. So all of these thousands of anti-epidemic stations were going to be turned into these modern, scientific, technologically advanced centers for disease control. This was the vision. The problem with this vision is that it was all talk for the most part at the time that they were rolling this out. So everyone changed their name, and maybe they got a little bit more money and a few extra people, but there wasn't really the kind of funding or momentum or focus needed to actually actualize this vision. And that's where SARS comes in. So just when this was being rolled out and no one really knew how it was going to turn out, was when the SARS epidemic happened. And just to review what that was, because most people who aren't as obsessed with this as I am have forgotten entirely about what happened. So this was a novel flu-like virus that first originated in the Pearl River Delta in late 2002, and then quickly spread around China, and then kind of made a break for the rest of the world in the spring of 2003, and that's when everyone started paying attention. So it killed about 800 people and sickened 8,000, a large percentage of them in China. And Chinese leaders at first denied that there was really a big problem going on, and eventually were forced to admit error when there was a whistleblower, a military physician in Beijing, who revealed to the international media that there were actually hundreds of cases of this in Beijing, and it was out of control. And there's a lot of embarrassment and also quite a bit of economic fallout when there were travel bans and bans on trade of certain animals that were sold to be eaten and things like that. So there was an economic fallout as well as a lot of embarrassment. And so China's leaders did a total about-face, and they started really aggressively instituting control measures, so including quarantining whole schools and city blocks, building a SARS treatment hospital in the span of less than a week just outside of Beijing, closing public spaces, and they also instituted this neighborhood watch system where people were supposed to kind of watch over each other and make sure you didn't have a fever, and then report you if you did. So, yes?
Is this, I understand you talked about the subjective reaction to it, but when you show these numbers, I'm sure 100,000 people or some number like that die of the cold in this month. So I understand the worry. Are you going to talk about kind of...
Yes, okay. So this was a very disproportionate reaction. And it was exactly that disproportionate reaction. And just to back up for a second, one of the reasons I got so interested in this is exactly what you're talking about. So I happened to be living in Guangzhou at the time that SARS broke out. And in Guangzhou, people were kind of like, it's another virus, whatever. I mean, there are a lot of things to worry about. And, open your window and scrub the floors with vinegar. And no one was worried about it. Meanwhile, my parents were having a panic attack. And they actually tried to quarantine me when I came home from China. I got evacuated. This is a whole other story. I got evacuated by the organization that sent me there, and my parents tried to quarantine me, and I broke my quarantine. I was really mad. And anyway, that all led to me doing this project essentially. So be careful what you, the fights you get in with kids. You might spend the next 15 years trying to sort it out. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This was a totally disproportionate reaction, and it was under a lot of pressure from the international community to do something about this and do it now. And this is sort of what China needed to do, was these sort of draconian measures that they're kind of good at. Now, whether or not this actually did anything to bring SARS under control is another question. And I think that epidemiologists are a little skeptical that this actually did anything. Because there's so many other factors for how this disease was spreading that the better theory that I sort of believe is that it burned itself out. It was a self-limiting epidemic. But in any case, the Chinese got credit for this. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, really praised their efforts, the CDC praised their efforts. And the effect of this was right when they were trying to figure out how to redo their system. And so now they had a purpose. Right? And they also had a lot of motivation. So there's huge amounts of money and political attention that suddenly started being put into these CDCs right at this time. And they were very, very rapidly professionalized. They started recruiting all of these educated elites I was telling you about to come and work there. Biomedicalized, scrapping the grassroots, and clean out the snails by hand and trying to make it more of a medical science. Hire a lot of epidemiologists and that sort of thing. Technologized, they bought all this fancy equipment. I mean, they had stuff at the city level that Brown would not string for in a million years to pay for. And more importantly, it was globalized. So local public health became really geared towards these global problems, rather than towards the here and now of kind of what are our problems here. It became geared towards these sort of, especially in this area that I'm talking about, where all of these viruses were coming out, it became geared towards stop these viruses, show we can do this, make sure this doesn't happen again, essentially. And so post-SARS public health became international rather than local interests. It became focused on the cosmopolitan urban middle class rather than the poor. So the target of kind of whose health are we trying to preserve really had to do with these kind of mobile elites and not so much with the poor who were targeted during the Mao period. That's generally true with the reform period anyway. And the floating population, so back to the floating population, became constructed as an obstacle to achieving these goals. These were the dirty, backward people who were going to get in the way of being able to have this modern system and also being able to prevent something like this from happening again. So the result, the argument I make in my book is that this led to what I call a bifurcation of service and governance. So there was a separation in terms of what public health folks were thinking about with populations, of the population that they should be serving, which were kind of some combination of like global elites and the rising middle class in the cities, and the population that they needed to govern in order to achieve that goal, and that were these unruly migrant workers. Okay, so what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk is the ways in which the educated elites, who were also migrants, if you'll recall, often from the very same places that the floating population was coming from, how these educated elites managed to build boundaries between themselves and the migrants, to differentiate themselves, so that they could kind of rationalize the way that they were thinking about this. And I want to emphasize at the outset that these were not bad people. They weren't trying to do anything bad, they weren't mean. But they did kind of, in the way that they were thinking about these populations, end up producing a system that I think was not very beneficial to anybody. So I'm going to start with the legal boundaries, and these were not put in place by any means by the public health folks, but they were supported and perpetuated by them. So the HUCO system of household registration was established in the 1950s to monitor and control population mobility. So basically, Mao is a very paranoid person. He wanted to have tabs on where everyone was and where they were going and make sure people weren't doing what they're doing now, which is sort of going off to the cities and nobody can account for them. So it's established exactly to control that situation. And people were assigned rural or urban status at birth. That was sort of the big differential. But your HUCO was located in a particular town. And you were only eligible for any sort of social services, and this is still true to some extent, including things like education and employment, healthcare, anything like that, in your hometown. So you had to stay put. So you weren't going to be arrested if you went to another city, but you couldn't access anything you needed if you went there. This was relaxed somewhat beginning in the 80s, especially if you were an educated elite. So it became much easier to change your hukou. If you got a job somewhere or you went to college somewhere, you could shift your hukou over to there. And that's what a lot of the educated professionals I knew had done. So they had grown up in rural areas or small towns, and they had gotten themselves an education and were able to shift to an urban hukou, and they really clung to that very, very tightly. More recently, hukou regulations have been relaxed, especially in interior cities even for the migrant population. So now it's possible if you're a migrant worker and you go to a smaller city in the interior of China, so not Shanghai, Beijing, or the Pearl River Delta, but somewhere that's less desirable, it's sometimes possible to get yourself a hukou there, or at least get the kinds of services you need. But it's much more difficult if you're trying to go to the big cities where most of them are trying to go. Migrants can apply for temporary or permanent residence cards, and that accounts for the people who are officially registered. So those original numbers I showed you, they're almost half of the population was not accounted for, but it's 60 to 80% who were floating migrants. So some of them were accounted for, and those were the folks who had signed up for official residence cards. And those cards do allow you to access some, though not all, of these services. But it's bureaucratically complicated, and you have to pay a lot of money, and people generally didn't want to be counted. They were afraid that they were going to be sort of deported back to their hometowns, whether that was a rational fear or not. They're afraid for being found out by the birth control authorities or having more than one child. There are a variety of reasons why people didn't want to register. So the registration rate was not very high when I was there. So as of 2010, as I noted, nearly half the floating population was still unaccounted for. Those with hukou, importantly, the people that I knew who worked in public health, really didn't want to extend that privilege to others. So they had managed to get themselves out of poverty, and they had gotten this urban hukou, and they kind of wanted to keep it to themselves a little bit. And just to give you an example of this, the folks I knew who worked in the HIV/AIDS control department, were explaining to me that in China, technically anyone who has HIV/AIDS who can't afford to pay for medication has the right to have the government give you medication for free. They're supposed to be able to get free medication. The catch is that that medication is handed out by local governments. So you need to go back to wherever your hukou is to get the free medication, which meant that effectively most of the people in Chiang Mai, the majority of people who have HIV/AIDS are in the floating population. You can get free treatment, but if you're you can get free testing, excuse me, but if you're diagnosed, you're advised to go back to your hometown to get the treatment. And so I asked them, isn't this kind of a problem for controlling AIDS, which is what you're supposed to be doing if you can't actually get the treatment to the people who most need it? And they said, yeah, we feel bad about this, it's not very good, but on the other hand, we have to have this system, because if anybody could come here and get a hukou or get hukou-like benefits, then there'd be this rush of people from all over the country trying to come to Chiang Mai and take advantage of our really nice services. Might sound a little familiar in terms of some of the discourse in our country, but that's definitely how they were talking about it. So they really were not, they didn't create the system, but they were happy to kind of have it the way it was. Another boundary that was drawn was linguistic. So people talked about Chiang Mai as being a city of immigrants. They used this very proudly. They compared it to America being a country of immigrants, and in 2008 that was still considered a good thing. I'm not sure people would talk about it quite that way anymore, but this was considered a good thing. But when they talked about being a city of immigrants, they were talking about immigrants like themselves, people who were creative, who were bringing all kinds of expertise to the city and building it into this really cosmopolitan place. And they use this term immigrant, iman, only for people like themselves. Okay, migrants, the floating migrants were not immigrants. They were never really called immigrants. They use different terms. This means peasant worker. This is the word for floating population. So those were the terms that were used. They were not immigrants, even though they like to talk about Chiang Mai being a city of immigrants. Another way in which people talked about the floating population, I think, was important, was very explicitly using words like dirty, backward, and low quality. People use this all the time, and again, in 2008, I was sort of more shocked by this than I would be now. But people were not shy about calling migrants what they kind of thought of them. And going along with this, migrants came to kind of stand in for anything infectious. So there was a measles outbreak while I was there, it was the migrants' fault. Hepatitis A and B were really big problems, it was the migrants' fault. While I was there, the H1N1 flu pandemic broke out, and people were very worried because they were sure that the migrant population was going to spread it in Chiang Mai. There wasn't a lot of evidence that this was actually necessarily the case, but that's basically who always got blamed. So that's actually not necessarily very interesting, because if you look throughout the history of public health pretty much anywhere around the world, people are always blaming the dirty immigrant for any sort of infectious disease problem. It happened here a lot too. But I think that something that is a little bit interesting about this case is, again, that these native inhabitants who were talking about them in this way were recent migrants from the very same places. Again, a lot of these people came from rural areas. So they were talking about people who were coming from their hometowns, essentially. And also that this group that was now the dirty immigrants had played an essential role in disease control in the past. So if we look back at the Mao period and the patriotic health campaigns, the rural population, the sort of dirty backward people, were considered to be highly infectious and the cause of a lot of these problems, but they were also seen as the solution to their own problems. So they were part of the solution, they could be mobilized to make things better. And there was still a lot of talk about this, actually, that from the central government, that you should be mobilizing the floating population and participate in these campaigns to improve their situations. But people said that that was basically impossible now. First of all, because people are not compliant like that. You can't just show up and say, go, dig this latrine. They said they'll just run away and go somewhere else, go to another city. They're floating after all. But the other thing is that it's very hard to find them, and this gets back to how you can lose half of your population, right? Where were these people going? And one of the answers that I was able to find to that was the actual spatial layout of where people were in the city. And I'm actually going to read to you briefly from a passage from my book, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So I wrote, as we drove to a local hospital in the Chiang Mai subdistrict of Gongping for an inspection of a hospital's malaria preparedness protocol on an afternoon in the fall of 2008, Dr. Lee, an epidemiologist at the Chiang Mai CDC, told me that the conditions at the hospital would likely be quite good because, quote, people who live in Gongping are really rich, and they all drive fancy cars. This was really confusing to me because Dr. Lee had just finished telling me that Gongping had a huge floating population, and the use of the term floating population almost invariably indexes poor migrant workers who could hardly be expected to drive fancy cars. When I asked him about this, Dr. Lee just looked at me quizzically before acknowledging that yes, 90% of the population, 90, was in fact floating population, and this population was in fact poor. But that was not what he meant when he referred to people who live in Gongping. In other words, 90% of the population were not Gongping residents. So the way in which I sort of figured out how this could be had to do with a phenomenon that's not unique to Chiang Mai or related to the Pearl River Delta, but is common in cities around China, and I'm told elsewhere it happens too, which are urban villages. Okay, so if you think about it, when you're building a city from scratch in essentially a rural area over the span of 30 years, it's a lot of trouble to kind of raise all the villages and start over. And so what happened is that, and this happened in other cities as well as the city expanded really rapidly, is they would literally swallow up whole villages in their wake and just sort of be built around them. And one of the deals that was made with the people who were living there is, we're going to take over your village, sort of, but we're going to give you urban hukou, first of all. And second of all, you're going to maintain a lot of autonomy. So the villages were able to keep ownership over this land. They were able to build the way they wanted to. They were able to avoid adhering to city regulations about things like crowding or sanitation or security or anything that you are supposed to be doing to keep a city safe, as it were. they could avoid a lot of those things and also make money, basically, off of renting out these properties. And so what ended up happening is that the urban villages, which made up quite a lot of space in Chiang Mai, were providing housing for a lot of these unregistered workers who were kind of crowded into this tenement housing. And so the villagers of old were essentially slumlords for the villagers of new. Okay? The people who were there became these really wealthy slumlords for the undocumented, the floating population. And the problem here is that, one, this makes them really hard to keep track of because these villages are basically under semi-autonomous government. Two, increase their vulnerability to disease because they're living in basically squalid housing, a lot of them. Three, decrease their access to services such as were available. So while I was there was some effort to start providing certain services to some migrant workers, but that wasn't going to happen here. And it also really irritated the public health workers because they had to make deals with these village leaders anytime they wanted to go in there and do anything. So if they wanted to do a vaccination campaign or anything like that, they had to basically drink with the village leaders. It's a whole other story. But they had to make friends with the village leaders and basically buy their cooperation to do anything with the migrant workers there.
Can you just explain what we're seeing in
Yes,
in
so
the
what we're
pictures?
seeing here is, this is I think this is Guangzhou actually, because this exists in Guangzhou too. This is old village housing surrounded by high-rises.
And so the new migrants are living in the old housing, which is owned by the old villagers?
Yeah, so a lot of times actually they would raise their own buildings and build high-rises, but they could build kind of however they wanted. So they would build, you know, really crappy buildings that were too close together, and that kind of thing.
And so are the new buildings we see, are those part of the village?
This is part of the city. Yeah. So
Where do the
literally
old
surrounds
villagers
the city.
live then?
Often they would build themselves like these really luxurious buildings to live in. So they're really wealthy. The people who were the original villagers who were there in like 1980, who got their really sweet deal, were really wealthy. And they often would move out of the village, or they would build some really luxurious housing for themselves.
But the big buildings we see in the background, those are not the village, that's the city that's been built in the farmland around the village or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, literally swallowed it up kind of in the middle. So you're walking around, and you see this in a lot of cities in China if you're paying attention. Sometimes it's not as obvious. I show this picture because it's so obvious. This is less common, although you do see it. Because oftentimes they do tear down those buildings and build ones that look more like cities. But literally, they're just in the middle. And sometimes you do see things like this. You're walking through a city and all of a sudden it looks like a village. You're in the middle of a city.
The thing on the right looks like a favela, home continent.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just the way the definition of the picture. I mean, maybe those are real structures, not just shanty.
Yeah. I don't think it's, yeah, they're low-rise buildings. But yeah, you're right, it does look like a. Okay. Any other questions about that? So I should note that some of these villages actually did build really nice housing and provided housing at very high prices for some of the more educated, more middle-class people who were coming to live there. So villages were not only slums for migrant workers, but that was one of the ways in which you sort of lost track of people. Okay, so the next boundary I want to talk about has to do with bureaucratic boundaries, and I'm putting this slide up just to give you a sense of the kind of Byzantine nature of the public health system. But actually, what the more I'm not going to stay on there because the more important slide is here, which is just to show that the public health system was kept very separate from the clinical care system. Okay, so, and they're actually called two separate lines. So if someone who was doing a public health project wanted to get data from a hospital, for example, it had to go up this way and then back down that way. There was very little cross-communication here. And people took these separations very seriously and actually liked them, even though it made it harder to do some of the things they wanted to do. They wanted, for the most part, nothing to do with the clinical care system. They mostly dealt with the floating population totally in the abstract through the statistics that were collected and delivered to them, and they liked it that way. They didn't want to be dealing with people for the most part. The exception to this is these outpatient health licensing clinics. So the migrant workers, if they wanted to work in the service industry at all, so in restaurants and entertainment centers like karaoke bars or something like that, anything where they had contact with people, they'd have to get an annual health license, which means you go to one of these clinics and be examined for a variety of infectious diseases, and then get a certificate that declares you free of these diseases. And they had to renew this every year. It was a big money-making venture, both for the hospitals and for the public health clinics. The one place in which people who worked in public health had this direct contact with people was in these migrant clinics that they ran. And boy, did they hate these migrant clinics. So this is just a quote from someone who had just gotten herself transferred out. She said, 4 or 5 days a week, I had to go to the factory and do physicals on the workers. So sometimes there were mobile clinics that actually go to a factory. It was horrible. It was so hot and stuffy, I felt like I was going to die. All the workers were dirty and all sweaty. There was so much sweat, and their skin had all these problems, and you had to touch them to do the exam. It was disgusting, and it felt very unsafe there. It was so hot and sweaty. When I came back, I would feel so dirty, and we would sometimes go through 1,000 people in one day. I couldn't take it. I got myself transferred as soon as I could. I have to say that I had some sympathy for this point of view after volunteering in one of these clinics for a couple of weeks. It was really hot and sweaty, it did smell bad, and you did get really frustrated with this assembly line of people that just came through for like 12 hours in a row. And so the way that these worked were in the bigger clinics, like the one that was housed at the Tiananmen CDC, 600 to 1,000 people would be processed per day, literally in an assembly line. So you would pay and have your photo taken, and then you'd be moved along and have your fingers swabbed and then pricked for blood. Then you'd be moved along and go into these gender-segregated like public rooms where you bend over and have a fecal sample taken right in front of everyone. Then you go and have a lung x-ray where they look for TB, and then you kind of get shuttered out, get a receipt, and leave. And so there was no sort of semblance of this is going to serve the migrant workers in any way. This was purely to, as it says here, to make sure they're not spreading diseases to the general population. This is just...
People coming voluntarily and paying?
Yes, because you have to get the certificate to say you're free from diseases to get a job in these places. If you got one of these certificates and you're an unregistered migrant worker, generally you'll be left alone. No one's going to come and, again, sort of deport you from your job or anything, but you will get in trouble if you don't have a certificate. So every year you had to go and get this renewed through this process. And this is just a picture of one of the mobile clinics who went to a restaurant to do this, and they would go to the restaurant and have like all the workers come out at once and just do it right there in the restaurant. So one of the things I asked when I was working in this clinic was, well, what if someone actually tests positive for something? Like, what if you do find TB in someone? They won't get the health certificate, but are you going to treat them or do anything to help them? And they said, well, yeah, I mean, we would tell them that they should get treated, but that's not really our problem, right? Because we, as this person said, we don't deal with individuals, we deal with crowds, and what we're treating is population groups. We aren't responsible for treating individuals. That's not what we do. So basically, it's not my problem. I'm not a clinician. I'm a public health person. That's separate. So it's not really, I will tell them that they should go, see a doctor, but it's not my business to do anything else. Okay, so I mean, this might seem sort of fair and reasonable if you think about this purely in terms of the separation of disciplines, right? Public health people deal with populations, clinical people deal with individuals, that's fine. But the problem is that with the division of labor, you also get this division of medical labor. Okay? And this is kind of how things shook out that I found pretty disturbing. So most members of the floating population are excluded from health access other than interaction with these clinics or with public health campaigns like when they vaccinate people. Because of some of the reasons I told you before, that they don't have health insurance, they don't have the right to really get aid with that. Seeing a doctor can be expensive if you don't have insurance. People were afraid to go to the hospital because, again, they had this fear of being found out. And so essentially they were effectively excluded from health access, except for these interaction with the migrant clinics, and then if they were being vaccinated for something, which happened a lot too. But the public health workers then excluded the floating population from the common good and excluded anything but the common good from their concern. Not my problem, only populations are my problem. And so sick members of the floating population became relevant only as a threat to be controlled. They were dangerous, they needed to be controlled, we need to deal with them in some way, but not to actually help them in any way. The only other way in which the migrant population came to be important to the public health workers was in the context of research studies. So this is a whole other part of my research that I'm going to talk about today, but I just want to touch on it briefly here at the end. Which is that these educated elites who had come to work in the public health institutions, I mentioned that they really wanted to go abroad, and one of the ways they felt they could accomplish this was by collaborating with international partners who wanted to do research. And what they felt they brought to the table, say with some place like Berkeley, that might want to do a research project in China, was access to a lot of people. Okay, this is sort of living big data. They had access to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And yeah, they had to drink with the village leaders to get at some of them, but once they did that, they could basically go to a factory, and the factory boss would round up, sometimes there were tens of thousands of workers in one factory, round up everybody to participate in this study. And it wasn't at all clear that people were voluntarily participating, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they weren't. But they were able to make use of the migrant population in this way, and actually found it to be very valuable in that sense. Okay, so I just want to end by raising the question of what the implications are here, which I think is pertinent well beyond China. Because when half of your population is invisible, reviled, and seen as a threat rather than someone to be helped, I would suggest that you have a problem. Right, and that you're probably not going to be terribly successful in improving the health of the city if you are ignoring the existence of half of the people who live there. So I'll just stop there, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. Yeah.
How has your research been received by these communities, if they've received it at all?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, the people in the public health institutions wouldn't really like anything I would have to say about them. There are a couple people who have read my work, most people who have left, and they generally said, yeah, this is pretty right, this is right. To be honest with you, I have not shared it with the leaders of the center, because I'm pretty sure they would not be very happy about it, but I recognize that they might read it, and that's one of the problems with doing research like this, is that if you want to be honest at all, sometimes people are not going to like what you write. But the people who have read it, one of the people who figures prominently in a lot of the writing I do in my book ended up emigrating to Canada permanently. And she read the book and said, yeah, that's how it is. So that made me feel better about it. But yeah, I don't think that a lot of people would like it.
And a follow-up, isn't the director of the WHO, Margaret Chan, didn't she didn't she achieve her presidency because of her reaction to SARS?
Yes, and that was another reason that people felt like this was a good model to be followed. Yeah, people held that up all the time. Margaret Chan, she did such a good job with SARS, and look at where she is now. Yeah.
So the view you've given is that this is a result of sociological and forces on the ground that create this uncaringness for the other, and but I would assume that the kind of, there's also a social engineering kind of, well, of course, scientific social engineering is the way to solve the problem, and if we don't have to treat people, we have to have the right public health policies. Big picture. That also is very consistent to me with not just public health philosophies around the world, but also the Chinese idea, the recent history of engineering. This is a technical problem.
Yes, and in some sense it was engineered as a technical problem, but what I was interested in looking at was how do people kind of rationalize this and become complicit in this problem? Because I sort of reject this suggestion that and I don't think this is how China works at all, at least not now, which is the government says something, everybody's like, okay, and they just believe whatever the government says. There is some of that, but I think people are more complicated than that, and I wanted to understand what was going on here that made this make sense to them. And that actually made it hard for the government to then make changes. So there were actually efforts going on right when I was doing my fieldwork that have continued to try to, recognizing this problem I suggested at the end, if we keep doing this, we're gonna create a problem, right? Rather than solve one. And so there were actually efforts to provide more health services for the migrants, to get people to kind of be nicer to them and pay more attention to them. This was happening at the same time that there was sort of a police crackdown on the migrants, so there were a lot of different messages coming in. But for the most part, people were kind of slow to get on board with that because of all of these other things that I'm talking about, that they really felt like these were not people that they particularly wanted to be helping. Yeah.
But given the fact that these people are not elected, right? The people who make the decision about the organization of the healthcare system, they're not elected, they're appointed with a mission, and they're not directly accountable to people who pay taxes or these wealthy people who are not interested in migrants. So is that representative of what's happening all over China, or is it specific to this area, the fact that these people are different?
What I'm describing?
Yeah.
It's pretty relevant all over China. I think it's kind of exaggerated in the space I was looking at because there's such an incredibly high percentage of migrant workers in this city and in the region in general. But it's definitely a phenomenon that people talked about at the national level also. And there were people, like I said, I mean, there were people trying to do something about this, recognizing this problem and trying to think about ways to better accommodate the migrant workers without changing those big laws about, just allowing everybody to get a hookah, right? But there was resistance to that, and I think they were having trouble kind of managing these different narratives that were being sent out about, law and order and go and modernize China, but then actually you should probably be nice to the migrant workers too and try to help them. These were a lot of disparate narratives that were going around, but my impression from talking with people at the national level was that this is a common kind of dynamic. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is very interesting. Could you talk a little bit about the distinction between crowd and population group, which appears in one of the slides?
Yeah.
Just maybe go back to it and just help us think through how those are the same and different.
Sure. So what I translated as population groups is not usually how people necessarily translate that. Sometimes they just say populations, and as they just say group, it kind of literally means a group of people. This kind of indicates the feeling of crowdedness, like a lot of people, right? And people use that a lot. So I mean, one of the things that's funny in talking to people about this and these kinds of issues in China is that people are very fixated on how many people there are in China and the fact that it's crowded, especially in urban areas. People talk about this all the time. It's really crowded. There are too many people, and this is sort of the explanation of why certain things are necessary, that we know this isn't good, but certain things are necessary here because there are just too many people. And so, talking about dealing with crowds, I think is has some significance, and that there was this feeling that people were talking all the time of certain things are necessary because there are just too many people in China, everybody's crowded too closely together, and it's a dangerous situation.
The reason I ask is that when you look in the emergence of population thought in Europe, you see in the 18th century people stop talking about multitudes and start talking about populations. So I was thinking crowds as multitudes, and sort of there's that. The tension between what are we talking about, what kind of aggregate is this, seems really interesting, and here you've got them both together, and I just thought that was
and there's another aggregate which is masses, and that was a term used much more during the Mao period. You're always talking about the masses, mobilizing the masses, and that was even more of a sense of this sort of like undifferentiated just mass of people. So people don't use that term as much anymore. I would say this is kind of in between term. That's a really interesting thing. I
was struck by your slide and discussion of the division, I guess it was within the health system where you had public health on one side and clinical on the other.
Yeah.
But not really knowing much about this, what I thought was, well, this isn't very different than the US.
Yeah.
People in the CDC, I don't know whether, I imagine them sitting at desks, looking at data.
Yeah, sure.
That's not different than most demographers.
Sure.
And it's probably not different than most people in the School of Public Health here,
Yep.
who in principle, we're interested in everybody, but in practice,
Yeah.
we're interested in data.
Exactly.
So that was one thought. The other was on the SARS. I hear what you say, and you're probably completely right, but still a part of me says, boy, I'm glad they threw all those resources at it. Successful prevention is hard to see and
Yeah.
easy not to appreciate.
Yeah,
And
sure.
we get so easily panicked about these things, and it's very hard to know whether it's realistic fear if something does spread globally and gets out of control, or do these things just tend to peter out?
Yeah.
Hard to say.
So you pointed to two really important points there. One being that what I'm describing is like you suggest, common to public health in most places. So that's why I said there's nothing inherently wrong with having that division of labor, right? Like we're not clinicians, we're not dealing with that. I mean, most public health people I know here, they're doing modeling, they're not paying attention to that. But in this particular context, I suggest ends up being a problem because these are the only people who they're really having access to in the healthcare system. And so the fact that it's being separated out in that way, and they are clinging to this, like, this is not our problem, we are numbers people, we don't do this, ends up being problematic. So again, not to blame them personally, you people should be fixing this problem, but just to kind of explain how it ends up being. So.
Their rhetoric is a little more explicit than
But you're absolutely right. There's nothing inherently surprising about that division, right? Because it exists in most places. And what you mentioned about preparedness is exactly, there's this constant tension and of, are we doing too much? But if we didn't do that much, would we be accused of not doing enough? And that was exactly kind of what the takeaway was from that experience was we were ignoring it and not doing anything. And then we brought out all of our, draconian measures to try to contain it. And that seemed to really please people. So we're going to try to do that again. And something that I didn't talk about, but which I talk about in my book, is when the H1N1 pandemic came, they were like all ready to do all of that again. One of the interesting things was that they were all primed to do all of that again, but then it wasn't really actually that scary, right? It was sort of just a regular flu, and it didn't come from China. It actually came in the other direction, North America. And that led to a whole lot of both confusion and disappointment because they rolled out this whole machine, and I was there, and that's when I was in the biohazard suit, sending people to quarantine, and they were ready to do all this stuff, and they started doing it. And the same people who were praising them for the SARS thing were like, what are you doing? You don't need to be like quarantining everybody. This is not a big deal. And anyway, it's already too late to do anything about it. It's already spread. And so there was a feeling of betrayal that came there because they had been doing all these trainings. I mean, the CDC came and did all these trainings with them, even at the local level. They were ready, right, to do this again. And that was the lesson they learned. This is important. And weren't really getting the subtleties of like, well, but this time, it's not actually that important that you do that. So, yeah.
Along the lines of understanding how to control epidemics, the fact that they're not dealing with HIV is really quite remarkable. I mean, the fact that so many people living in such crowded quarters, it does seem like there's a special need for a really assertive machinery to deal with risk of something like the SARS, or H1N1 if it's more aggressive or something. And yet, HIV is not in that category, and I don't know, and other kinds of infectious diseases, it appears if you're not a hooker and you can't get treatment, those too.
Yeah, so
how do they balance out the epidemiological agenda with the clinical agenda?
Yeah, so there was actually one of the other things that happened after SARS was there was a lot more emphasis on doing something about HIV/AIDS because at that time they were also kind of denying that this was a big problem in China And so a lot of attention did go to that, and they developed this dedicated HIV/AIDS department in the city, even at the district level, that were working on this. And in a lot of ways, they were very progressive when it came to prevention. So they would go to, when I was rotating with that department, they went out to gay bars at night and would distribute condoms and do testing. I mean, they actually were very active in trying to do something about prevention. But when it came to treatment or providing, resources, that was when, they sort of drew the line. And that had more to do with worrying about things like the HUCO and those boundaries that they wanted to keep than anything else. So the people who worked in HIV were very dedicated to it. I really was very impressed with them. They did a lot of outreach. It was really, really good. And they did do free testing. And if you were a pregnant woman, you could get free medication, even if you were a migrant worker, to prevent transmission to the baby. So anything that had to do with prevention, they were really very active in trying to do something about it, and that also came out of SARS. So there are a lot of good things that came out of that, but the treatment was different.
Okay, we have to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.